All right. Right. So I'll hand the floor over to Marion, who's going to give an introduction to the book. We'll then, if this is okay, we'll then pass it over to Nilu, who will talk about her chapter, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. So we'll say, if you have any questions for Marion, as I'm sure you will, I'll probably have a few myself, write them down, remember them, and then we'll have, they can be part of the overall discussions in about half an hour. So Marion, I'm handing the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank everyone for being here today. I'm gonna Can you see my screen on my presentation?
Perfect.
Yeah. I would like also to thank Nilu for having come with me for this presentation today. So it was interesting to meet her for the first time, because this is an international, group who has contributed to this book, and we have mostly, some of us have met already in person, but some of us haven't. So that was actually a nice thing to meet with you, Nilu, for the first time. Okay, so I'm gonna present you the book as one piece, and then Nilu is gonna deepen her chapter, which is one of the chapter of the first part of the book. And so first, this is, as you mentioned it before, the title is Aging and Migration in a Global Context. I'm Marion Repetti. I work as a professor at the School of Social Work of the University of Applied Sciences and Arts of Western Switzerland. And this book, on this book, I have worked together with Toni Calasanti, who you might know. She is an American sociologist. She does aging and inequalities and welfare state. And she works at Virginia Tech in the US. And then Chris Philipson, whom you may know as well, who is also a sociologist doing social gerontology. And he works at the Manchester Institute for Collaborative Research on Aging at the University of Manchester. So, oh yeah, that's the thing. Wait a minute, sorry about that. Here we go. So first, the book is really situated at the nexus of aging and migration. So just to give you some ideas, as you know, the world population is aging. We have a growth in the size and proportion of older people here. We have the United Nations who say that in 2019, we had 703 million persons aged 65 and over, and it should be 1.5 billion in 2015, so more than the double. And then we have also a changing in the migration trends with an increased migration and the globalization of the life course, to which I'm going to come back later. And here the UN says that between 1919 and 2019, we passed from 153 million to 271 million people living in a country different from the one in which they were born. So generally, what can we see at the nexus of these aging and migration trends? First, although the mean age of migrants mean age ranges from 38 to 40, that changes a little bit only between 1919 and today. So it's most of the, the age mean is pretty low, yet we do have 11% of the international migrant stocks who are aged 65 and over, and this is a stable percentage in time. We also know that the motivations to migrate mostly rely to the search for better and safer economic and political and social life. And we also know that there are various interactions between aging and migration, with some people who have migrated in an earlier stage of their life course and age in the place where they have migrated. We have people who return to their to the country where they were born. We have return migration, namely people who relocate to a new country for the first time at the time when they retire. We have second home owners, and these people tend to frequently move from one country to the other, typically seasonally. We have what we can find labeled as flying grandmothers, who are these grandmothers who travel regularly to another country in order to provide care to their grandchildren and come back and go again and come back, etc. We have family reunification. We have really different contexts in which this interaction between aging and migration can take place. And we also know some elements about the consequences of the migration-based globalization of the life course. First, the fact that families in this context are increasingly geographically dispersed. And another aspect which is important is that this transnationalization of the life course or globalization of the life course challenges welfare states policies which have developed in the 20th century, as those are based on models of citizenship which are attached to one single nation, with consequences on migrants' access to welfare state policies and on their own social and health security, which often is poorer than those of the nationals. And finally, there is a transnational care circulation with younger people and older people organizing and providing care to people within and across countries. So these are very broadly the basis of the development of this book. And the reason why we have put this book together is that we found that aging and the aging population and the increased migration have major importance over the 20th and into the 21st century. So now the focus of the book is really, first, all the chapters are really looking at older migrants. I'm working also on retirement migration, so sometimes I make errors in the words I use. So the experiences of older migrants, this is really the basis of the book. So we look at experiences, and all these experiences we look at are at the interactions between aging, migration, and the welfare state. So welfare state policies. So all the chapters of the book are in the middle of the three circles here. That was really a wish we had for this book, is that it should really play with these three dimensions in different contexts. So the topics of the book are most of the chapters of the book are discussing these topics. So one major topic is gender, class, and ethnicity and older migrants' experience in the global north. We also have migration, care, and retirement policies, and how these interacts with care circulation and older migrants' access to social and care provisions. We also have family support and older people's agency in transnational families, migration in retirement, and local and global systems of class, gender, and ethnicity. Here it's more particularly the case, a topic that it's particularly present in the chapters that rather look at retirement migration or north-south migration. And finally, stereotypes and ethnicity relations in care policies for older people. So here I have just given you an view on the structure of the book. Well, basically we have an introduction and conclusion. So the introduction is about what I've just said before. I'm going to come to the conclusion later, but we have wanted to organize the book in three main topics, three parts. It's always I have made the experience, I don't know if it's always because it's the first time I edit a book, but it's complicated to know how to construct these groups of chapters, because of course you can you can find topics in one chapter in part one, for instance, which can also be reflected in one chapter of part three. But what we really wanted is to have three lenses, three different frameworks on how authors address these interactions between aging, migration, and the welfare state. And this is what these three parts are about. And before I just tell you about the chapters, I should also specify that most of the chapters, or maybe not most of them, but at least half of them, include a Swiss context, something related to Switzerland. One reason is that the book is a result of an output of a workshop that I have organized in Lausanne, in the University of Lausanne some years ago. And so the participants were, some of them were Swiss and others were from the UK or the US or Germany. But so we had, in fact, several papers, chapters based on Switzerland, but also we found that Switzerland is an interesting context because of the migration policies, as well as the welfare state policies. And I'm not going to develop about this here, but if you want to ask questions about that, of course, we can discuss this aspect later. So now we have a first part, which is about migration and experiences of aging. This is really a part about how older people experience migration in the global north and how they make their decisions and how they access to services and how they interact with other, with the population where they live. So the first chapter is the one that Nilu is going to present. It's Migration and Transnational Communities, Construction of Home and Neighborhood in the Lives of Older Migrants. So I will let Nilu present it later. Then we have Entrepreneurial Grannies, Migration and Older Left Behind, Cochabamba, Bolivia, which is about how grandparents, grandmothers especially, whose adult children has migrated abroad, how do they deal with their situation? It challenges the idea that, left behind older people are only victims in a way. In this chapter, the authors also want to show what they are, how they act in this situation to improve their life. And then we have a chapter by Romina Seminario and Niki Lefebvre. Oh, sorry, the previous chapter is by Tania Bastien and colleagues. Here it's a chapter 4 by Romina Seminario and Niki Lefebvre, which is the retirement scenarios of Peruvian migrants in Switzerland. And it's about migrants from Peru who live in Switzerland and who are now at the stage of their life where they make decisions where to live their retirement. And the chapter looks at how they make the decision. Are they going to stay in Switzerland, or are they going to go back to their home country? Are they planning to move regularly between the countries? And the chapter shows how this relies on these migrants, gender, family relations, and other resources in the new country and in the home country. Then the second part is migration, family, and care, and it's really looking at care circulation in migration context and between generations. So we have a first chapter by Amel Mahfoud and colleagues, which is about elder care and transnational families and the Swiss immigration regime. So how the Swiss immigration regime frames or what is the impact of this regime on migrants' abilities to provide care to their older parents abroad or in the country when the parents join them in Switzerland. Chapter 6 is context of migration and the use of welfare provision, the case of Romanian older migrants in Switzerland. So here we have two generations of Romanian migrants, some who came as political refugees 30 years ago, and others who came recently and who rather come to provide support to their adult children and grandchildren in Switzerland, and how these two different scenarios have an impact on their capacity, ability, possibility to access welfare provision. So social policies and health policies in Switzerland and in Romania. And the chapter 7, last chapter of part 2, is linked life dividing borders from transnational solidarity to family reunification of an older parent. And that's again in the Swiss context, and how family, so how adult migrants who want to actually have their older parents join them in Switzerland. How is this experience of family reunification related to the legal system as well as the welfare state system, so health and social support policies in Switzerland? The last part is a bit different. So the two first parts were really rather focused on south-north migration, although as I presented, of course, you have these it's not static, actually. People can, move again, move back and come back again, etc. So it's not a static situation, but it's rather about migrants who basically came from the global south to the global north. The last part is the opposite. So it's about how older people in northern countries, richer countries, make use of migration to improve their economic and social life. So we have a first chapter. So the title is Migration as a Response to Challenge. And here we have a first chapter by Tony Calasanti and myself, which is about retirement migration and resisting ageist expectations and genders. Script, so it's a gender analysis, based on gender and ageism analysis of the motivation and experiences of retirement migration in Switzerland, England, and England and the US, two countries in the south. Now, then the ninth chapter is by Kira Kosnic and colleagues, Policy Dimensions of Retirement Migration from Germany to the Turkish Riviera, comparing German and German-Turkish older migrants. And it's a chapter where the authors look at how retirees in Germany who relocate to Turkey, but it compares two different groups. One group is German people who have never, go out of Germany, basically, but they relocate at the age of retirement. And the second group is a group of Turkish people who migrated at a younger life stage and relocate later in life. And it looks at how, again, migration and health and social policies in Germany and in Turkey, actually, how these frameworks, legal frameworks, shape these two groups' abilities to move between countries and make decisions, and the kind of decisions they make. The chapter 10 is a chapter again by myself and Sarah Schilliger, In Search of a Good Life in and Out of Switzerland, Making Use of Migration in Older Age. And here we actually compare two use of migration. I don't know if we say it so. One is, again, retiring abroad, and the other one is hiring migrant care workers, workers who work 24 hours in your home, and how people make decisions about, migrating abroad or hiring migrants, and why they make these decisions in relation particularly to their health, economic, and social resources. And the last chapter is Migrants in Media Representations of Elder Care, Ambivalent Sentiments by Sandra Torres and Jonas Lindblom. And here it's an analysis of newspapers and how these newspapers talk about migrant carers who provide care to care workers who provide care to older people, and how these newspapers in Sweden, how they reflect certain stereotypes. So this is the book, and we conclude the book with some elements. I shall say before getting into the conclusion, the book was written before the pandemic, which means that, as I said, it's mostly a result of this workshop that we had organized. It was in 2018, I think, 2018. So the book do not include, reflections about the pandemic. Yet we have, we have published it now. So we have made a discussion about the pandemic, the effects of the pandemic on aging and migration in welfare state context in the conclusion chapter. So in conclusion, the book is an exploration of various aspects of the experiences and challenges that transnational migration involves for older people and their families. The context of this migration and the attitudes towards migrants reflect cultural, economic, and political environment operating within and between countries, which I hope you have understood when I was presenting the different chapters. And the book highlights different issues that migrants face, such as pressure related to racism, maintaining care responsibilities for children, parents left behind, as well as uncertainties about accessing care. As well, migrant strategies to improve their circumstances and the impact of intersectionality, the intersecting inequalities of age, gender, ethnicity, and class on transnational migration. We could also here say that citizenship is also one of these system of inequalities that is also included in some of the chapters. Now about COVID-19. So what we explain in the conclusion is that the pandemic has underlined various inequalities affecting migrants, such as poor housing conditions with overcrowding, accelerating the spread of the virus, limited access to health care, dangerous work conditions, problems arising from pre-existing vulnerabilities due to poor language skills, mental health issues, and financial problems. And the book has the pandemic has also increased challenges experienced by migrants resulting from a culture of distrust and discrimination. And also, at the same time, the situation has shown that the healthcare systems, caring mostly for older people, rely on the support of migrant and foreign-born workers. And here, for instance, in the UK, about 30% of doctors and 20% of nurses are foreign-born. And we have a similar situation in Switzerland with 33% of medical staff who do not have the Swiss nationality. So if we look to the future, we can say that the pandemic has strengthened arguments about developing a welfare state which will fully incorporate the needs of migrants of all kinds, and that issues faced by migrants often lack visibility, including in how welfare states systems are organized, such as exploitation and lack of rights, isolation. Typically, we had I mentioned the case of these live-in migrant care workers, which is something that we discuss in the book, as well as limited access to personal care. So basically the idea, what we find important for the future, although it is challenging, but that social policies as a set of arrangements framed within nation states should have a more explicit transnational dimension than is presently the case, and particularly with this idea of an increasing transnationalization of the life course and family being, living all over the place, to say it so. So basically what we can discuss later, if you're interested, is what are the research priorities for aging and migration. But now, if that's okay, I will stop sharing so that I can let Nilu present this first chapter.
Thank you very much, Marion. I shall attempt to share, and hopefully you won't see all of my screen, you'll just see. I'm going to minimize us on the side. So yes, so I thank you for that presentation, Marion. That was really interesting, and it fits really well with what I'm going to talk about. So our chapter is about constructing home in migrant landscapes. And it draws on research from 3 different pieces of research across 3 locations of different migrant groups. And I'm going to talk very broadly today about the work that we've done. And then I want to sort of go on and talk a little bit about some useful lenses that we can apply in gerontological research and ethnographic research. So I want to talk about longitudinal research aspects, and also about intersectionality as a really helpful meta theory that can sit alongside other aspects that we use in our research. So the idea of home has really attracted lots and lots of different scholars from across disciplines. And I'm a multidisciplinary scholar. I have a background in psychology and sociology, and I've moved into practicing as a psychotherapist as well. So lots of my work with older first generation migrants comes from community work that I've done, and an engagement in communities that still forms a large part of the wider work that I do. And what we find is that the way that home is described is it's situated across multiple levels of belonging. It's something that's situated geographically, it's in the imagination, it's fixed in policies about who belongs, who doesn't belong, and it changes over time, and our sense of home changes over time. So I've got quite a lot of visual slides that I'll talk you through, mainly because it just felt that might be easy. And these always morph depending on where I'm talking and who I'm talking to. But I tend to see home as being the multifaceted and more of a process than a fixed entity. And in our research, what we did is there are 3 sites, one in the north of England. So that's Liverpool and Manchester, and that's a study by Sharf and colleagues working with Somali and Pakistani communities. Tina's work in Brussels was with Moroccan and Turkish migrants, sorry. And our work in Tower Hamlets in London was with first generation Bangladeshi women specifically. So they're quite different populations. But what we found through our work is that there are commonalities of the way that the migration process is experienced and how home becomes constructed over time. And some of those key areas are things like family and neighborhood. And there is that dynamic relationship between people and place. And if there's one way of describing my work, that's it, is how do we as individuals impact the spaces that we inhabit, and how are we impacted by the spaces we're in? And we find that as migrants began to settle in place, well, they began to establish places of belonging. So these could be things like grocery shops, mosques, coffee shops, places that people were able to go and share networks. And sometimes, certainly in the north of England with migrants there, it would be factories. So people had arrived on visas to work, and they began to recreate kin networks. And we were really interested in all of these very different pieces of research, in how our experiences and the models of migration and traditional norms are mapped onto new places when people move, and what is new. So how do those shifts in identities, what's retained, what becomes transformed ever so slightly, family relationships are a key one, and what becomes discarded altogether, and when do those discards happen, when does that change happen, and what are the factors that intersect with that? And we find that things like policies are really important. So a lot of the migrants that we worked with in our London study, so I'll speak a bit more about that because I can speak to that in more detail. People migrate at different times. We know that we're in very hostile climates now, and every sort of generation, every 20, 30 years, there is a period where it's exceptionally hostile. And so when migrants were arriving in the 70s, in a very kind of recession hit period of the UK economy, they were a useful scapegoat for many people, and policies began to spring up about who could belong, where people could get housing, where people were allowed to stay. And of course, that then becomes transformed into discourse about people choosing to self-segregate without looking at the wider lens of where people were able to settle when they arrived. Where was it safe to settle if you were a new migrant to the UK? Things like emotional belonging are really important as well, because we find that people might well hold a physical sense of space and belonging in the UK, but emotionally their ties transcend national borders, and they're not only to the places that they have traveled from, but there might be family members who've migrated to other parts of the global space. So sometimes people, when you ask about where is home for you, they say, well, I've got a brother in America, I've got a sister who's in Canada, and actually there's no one left in my country. So I suppose that's where my home is, but I've never been to those spaces. So the complexity of how home is constructed begins to become very apparent, and lots of symbolic constructions of home as well. Often after people arrive, and there's lots of research that supports this, about we tend to hold on for our own psychological safety onto traditions and onto behaviors that were meaningful, even if they weren't great, even if the traditional gender roles weren't exactly what we want. It gives us a sense of familiarity, and in familiarity there is safety. And so people would often find that they were enacting the same roles because there was comfort in that. So even to sort of move away from all of the negativity. And this isn't just about people being negative, it's about weather. And some of our migrants in these studies, especially because we're looking at older migrants, arrived at a time before there was the global boom in media, and people arrived without knowing other people. Networks were smaller. We didn't have access to information. Migrants today arrive very well informed, either through global media, and it might be a glossy interpretation of what life in the West is like, but it gives people an indication of how people might dress, what people might look like, what the weather and housing is. And many migrants arrived at a time when actually they knew nothing about what to expect. So there was this huge assault on their entire psyche of everything that was different. And being able to create kin networks was really important at that time. And depending on where people arrived, that had a huge impact. So our research was based in urban sites across the north, in Brussels and in London. And that has a real impact on how people settle. Because if you've got a community that has access to resources, and that might be things as simple as transport, being able to catch a bus outside in a relatively short area, distance from walking from your home, it has a huge difference. And we found in our work that there was that sort of dynamic relationship. As services grew, people began to establish their own sense of belonging. And of course, there are gendered aspects to home as well. So whilst men could make those networks much easier because they were going out to work, because there was grocery shops coming up much sooner, they were able to facilitate new networks, and their sense of belonging almost situated itself a lot sooner. Whereas for women, it began to emerge a little bit later as their children were being taken to school, and then often much later as they began to take their grandchildren to school. So that's some of the stuff that we discuss in that chapter. And I'm going to leap into much of the work that I do. It's situated in this frame of intersectionality. And this image that I have, this model, again, it morphs depending on what little things I want to add at different times. And it's not exhaustive by any means. But it's a really useful meta theory because it fits across disciplines, it fits across different groups that we work with. And the term itself, I'm sure all of you will be familiar, was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw as a response to the way that white feminism excluded women of color. And since then, it's taken on its own real kind of aspects across different areas of research, across areas of society. Lots of work can fit into this model because essentially all it says is that we are all a multiplicity of the different identifications we hold, and that one person's experience of being one thing. So my experience as a woman of color is not necessarily the experience of another woman of color. My experience as a South Asian woman who's Muslim won't map onto somebody else. So we need to, in our research, really interrogate the terms that we're using. And this is why something like BAME has become so problematic, because as migration has increased over the last 30, 40 years, we are now seeing groups that we hadn't accounted for before. I do work with people who are all, from different countries, from smaller areas. So where are the Syrians in our BAME categorization? Where are the people who might be of mixed heritage? I work with somebody who's Russian and Chinese. There is no box for them to fit into. So being really thoughtful when we think about how we do research, how we construct our questionnaires, how we think about people's identities, involving people in that sort of co-production of that research material is really important. We know that, where people arrive to that geographical space is really important. If I'm arriving to a place that's already got some services set up for me, it's much easier for me to leave the house and go and engage. If I don't speak the language and I don't know where anything is, and I know that when I do go outdoors, I'm going to struggle, then that becomes quite problematic. As migrant communities age, there are issues around care roles as well. Who provides that care? In an area like Tower Hamlets, where I've done my work, it was really useful because care services have evolved. And those service providers, we have a local authority that's largely staffed by people who are of Bangladeshi heritage as well. So they know what the needs of care responsibilities, the gendered aspect of provision of care, the fact that people might want to do ablutions for prayers, all of that is catered for. Whereas if somebody is aging, and I'm from Swansea in Wales, which now has a decent sized community, but not when I was growing up, there isn't that provision. And so it's really difficult sort of to create that sense of belonging and to feel that sense of home in there. And so lots and lots of dimensions here that I'm really happy to talk about. Gender specifically for me is really important because we see how gender changes over the life course and how our experience of gender changes. So gendered spaces, things like mosques and shops and grocery shops were very exclusionary to Muslim women. But over time, actually women have enacted those spaces and taken responsibility and taken up space in spaces that were previously male dominated. And that shifts the whole dynamic of the community and their trajectory going forward. And this is really important because it also maps onto the next thing that I want to talk to you about, qualitative longitudinal research. And I should say that the Tower Hamlets research that was in that chapter is based on research that I did with Chris Phillipson and Joanna Latimer in 2001. And then for my doctoral thesis, I decided that I'd go back 10 years later and revisit the same women and do a bit more research. And what this showed is that it's so important to do qualitative longitudinal research because so much of ethnographic research sort of sits here in that sort of snapshot of this is migrants and this is their experience. And we can use that to then talk about migrants in a very othering kind of way. And much of the research that we were looking at in 2001 was very negative and spoke about migrant groups in very disadvantaged terms. They were uneducated, they were poor, they didn't want to integrate with other people. And we have seen such shifts. And again, I'll talk about the Bangladeshi community because that's where my research sits. And the advances in one generation, in 10 years, not even a whole generation of women in employment, women in education, of young people across genders in really high profile jobs, going to university, they outperform so many other local groups in Tower Hamlets. And so that shift happens very, very quickly. But if we are looking at just one point in research and then referring back to that over time, we tend to miss out on aspects that were pre-migration that were really important to people's lives, that we might ask about gender roles, we might ask about what was going on for you at that time, but there will be things that we don't ask about. So much of this research methodology, I've sort of moved into ways of co-producing that. And then what happens after we've done that research? We find out lots, people's family structures change, people's roles and obligations within families change as well. And how does the recession and the economy and the hostile climate, Theresa May sort of, if you're here illegally, go home, those kind of messages, how does that impact our sense of belonging? And one of the things that we found in our research, certainly when I went back in 2001, I interviewed well over 100 women. Nobody felt that they were British, that they had a sense of belonging. 2011, over 50% of the sample went, yeah, why would we feel anything but British? And that was a confluence of factors, including the way the space had changed around them, their own confidence, their family, young girls growing up and going, no, we're going to do this, or sons saying, look, why don't we shift this? You can do this, and creating confidence. And often grandchildren, they would be reading ABC with their grandchildren, and kids would be bringing books home, and suddenly language ability of first generation women who are now in their 60s began to grow exponentially. And they were going out and finding new ways of belonging. And I think that might be my last slide. I think that's me done. sorry, I'm just aware that we want to do some questions, and I'm so happy to talk about all of these things. And I just thought I wanted to really introduce you to different ways of thinking about how you might approach the methodology in working with migrant groups. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Nilu. So we have finished our presentation and we are happy to answer questions or try to.
Yeah, let me try and stop sharing.
Right.
But you carry on without me. Ah, there it is. Thank you very much.
Really exciting book and exciting chapters. It covers the book sounds like it covers a number of different aspects of migration, experiences of from different people. It's comparative in terms of the welfare state, and it covers a wide range of different issues that older migrants might face in terms of retirement planning, housing, caring responsibilities, work in the caring sector. Has a little bit of something for everybody. I've got a couple of questions, but I'll open up the floor to the group, and I think it's small enough where you can just unmute your microphone and ask the question. I had a class yesterday, about 2 days ago, in which we had about 160 students, and that didn't work so well that way. It took about a half an hour just to get them to all mute their microphones so I could speak. But if anybody has questions, and if not, I'll throw in one that I have, which is about the issue of solidarity. One of the I've done a bit of work with the YN Society in Manchester. Some people on the call have as well. And this group, it's a group that represents and supports the Chinese community in the Manchester area. They're very well connected. They're very well organized. It's a close-knit community. But one of the things that impressed me about the organization is that it supports migrants from other communities as well, those who are less organized, who are less plugged into to policymakers and support services and so forth. And is this something that you found either in your research or your work with people within different communities, so those supporting one another, so that everybody sort of all boats are lifted by what is the term? A good tide lifts all boats.
Nilu, do you want to answer about your research?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yes is the answer, and I think that's very much a feature of groups becoming established. As in previous times when groups were arriving, there was such a scarcity of resources. There was fear about belonging. There was a lack of knowing about processes and how they work and how you go and access welfare, how you go and access housing, what you can do for jobs. That capital wasn't in place. People didn't have those resources. Now, as the communities have become established, we know things. We're into second and third generation. And so people are much more aware. And so when new groups arrive, there isn't that competition for resources. There isn't that fear about what's going to happen. Are they going to get housing and we won't get housing? People know how systems work. So we have the capacity to be able to support others in a way that previous groups hadn't had.
To complete this, I could also add that we actually find similar social support through volunteering in return and migration context, which is a very different context. Of course, it's not north-south migration, but we see that the retirees who relocate to countries such as we have worked in Spain, Costa Rica, and Mexico, do get involved in volunteering for in groups composed of return migrants or with the local community, depending, and how this this kind of social activity through volunteering can really play a role in helping new return migrants getting included in the new community with limits, of course. It's not perfect. It's not to say that, yes, everything is easy or so, but we can see that this is a very important way to provide support to each other and get included, either because when people receive support or by providing support.
Soja is asking a question. This is a really interesting presentation. I'm curious if you considered intersectionality as individual categories intersecting or as social systems.
Both.
So, oh, sorry. Oh,
Sorry.
Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
And just because I'll keep it very brief, but yes, both, because you cannot understand the experience of any individual category without the social structures that we're situated in. And so being able to understand that, and then within the social and historical context, it becomes quite messy when you start to try and pull things together. But actually, without that lens, we can't even begin to interrogate what that lived experience is for individuals. Marion.
Yeah, well, similar answer. Basically, the book, as I said before, the book is all about experiences which are at the crossing of aging, migration, and welfare state context. So welfare state, by welfare state context, we mean, the regimes of migration policies, of retirement policies, and of health policies particularly. So mostly these are the three kind of legal contexts which we look at. So we look at how these legal systems frame certain contexts in which people make experiences. And here, that's where we apply the intersectionality system. So these people are situated, so just need to explain this very well. So, but yeah, I don't know if this answers the question.
In terms of social systems, I guess there's a question there in terms of the policy response as well. I mean, I've been working in the field of age management and how employers need to adapt their HR policies to an aging population. So if I'm an academic making policy advice on older workers, and I need to incorporate a migration dimension to this, what would be the starting point for that? Do we start with what already exists in terms of what we know about older workers and then apply a migration context to that? Or do you need to really start from scratch and say, well, the experiences of older migrants are going to be so different from those of the host population that the policies need to start from scratch as well.
So what I can say, well, I would say that well, first I'm more rather working on aging, so I would rather talk about aging, and maybe Nilu, if you have some more information or some things to complete. But I'm working on Switzerland. I'm comparing often Switzerland, the UK, and the US, and working on retirement migration. And we see that the way that age is treated in relation to work is already very different between countries. And typically in Switzerland, most of the people have to retire at 65 years old. So you do not, like typically in academics, if you are 65, you retire. And we do see the consequences of this kind of age treatment on how people experience aging in the society. And we can see these differences in how retirement migrants talk about their experience of retiring in Switzerland, the UK, and the US. So just saying that even how age is treated is already different. And I would say as a Swiss citizen that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of age. So
can I make a question, please?
I'm not familiar enough with migration issues to be able to answer these aspects. That's why I didn't know if Nilu, you had more to say about it, but.
Not so much more, other than the experiences of migrants are so different. So it depends on, am I older because I've lived here for 30 years, or am I an older migrant because I arrived 16 months ago? And what are the skills that I bring if I'm an educated professional migrant versus somebody who came to the country with limited education? So there are so many variables within that it becomes difficult to start from the ground up when it comes to the migrant experience, because there isn't one. And it's more about adapting policies so they are flexible enough to meet the needs of an aging workforce. And that will include non-migrant populations as well, because everyone's experiences are so different.
Let me go to Lucy and then to Moses. Lucy put her hand up, and I'll put her in there. There you go.
Thank you. I'll just say that it's 9 o'clock at night in Sydney and I'm a little bit worse for wear. So just first of all, thank you so much. The book, it sounds fantastic and we'll be trying to get it in Australia. But my question really is to Nilu. Nilu, I really like the home concept as you constructed it, and belonging and the change in belonging. And my question really is about how migrants relate to other migrants from other places as they, change in their conception of belonging and experience of belonging. Have you found that as they age, they engage more outward or inward? I take the point that Marion made about the volunteering, but that's the individual agency, if you like. And what I'm interested in, because it intersects with what we're doing, looking at the support organisations, is to really explore what the relationship is with others as people age and the language changes. You gave the case of through the grandchildren, they, improve in their perhaps English, whatever. But some people we interviewed recently pointed out that some people actually revert back to their own languages, and that makes them more isolated in a way. So I'm wondering if you could sort of explore that dimension.
Yeah,
and thank you. It was great.
Thank you, Lucy. Such a fascinating question, and two aspects there before I forget. The first one on the language, yes, we found that people went back. And that was partly to do with the fact that they had global TV streaming into their homes. And so, whereas before they were forced to learn the language, so on TV, all they had was whatever was streaming on the UK channels. And so they had to learn English through that, whether it was just almost an automatic response, they were picking up the language. But then when global cinema started to arrive, those drama series were really useful and they felt connected, and it was a lovely way of connecting to the homeland. However, they lost their language. And so when I spoke to some of the women, I went back and said, I spoke English better before. And that also intersects with the next point about the groups people engage with. In Tower Hamlets, women don't need to speak English, or anybody doesn't need to speak English, because your doctor will speak your language, the receptionist will speak the language. It's such a big community. And so people don't even need to interact with newer arrivals. Whereas in other parts of the UK, where there are disparate minority groups, there is that strength in numbers, and people will come together, and there are organizations that support new arrivals, or women's group is a great one. So if there's a women's group, it might pull in women of different groups, and they come and make those connections there. So I think that place aspect is really important in determining how much engagement people have with other groups.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll hand it over to Moses. Marita has a question as well, and then Saja. We're going to run a few minutes over, but this is such a great conversation. I think it's warranted. So, Moses.
Yes, thank you for your presentations, both of you. I want to say that it seems that there were no studies about the impact of the freedom of movement. I mean, how does it affect each country? And then how does it affect those people coming from outside the European Union, and the difference, how it affects between regular migration and irregular migration. So those who are staying in isolation in camps, and the others who have a work permit to work. I think these subjects have to be dealt in more depth. That is my modest opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, so we do have several chapters in the two first parts, particularly in the second part of the book, which are looking at how legal, like migration legal systems have an impact. What are their impact on the abilities of family? So the family's abilities to move from one place to the other, particularly in contexts where either the older people in the family, the older members of the family have to join their children to provide support to the children and grandchildren typically, or receive support from them. So we do have chapters in the book which focus, two chapters which are focused, well, this is the Swiss context, so, but it does, these are people who are especially, you know, specialized in laws and migration, and who are looking at that. But yeah, it's, as you say, it's an important but also so complex situation. Typically, as a Swiss, a woman, Switzerland is not in the EU, so there is all the this complex system with EU members, non-EU members, outside, like third, you know, third circle countries and all those things. So certainly there is a lot to be done in this context in terms of research.
Thank you.
Marita?
Thank you. It was really very interesting for me. Thank you very much for both presenters. I have seen the book in the internet, and today I am much more interested even to read it. I teach social policy at the University of Tirana, and I have been working for almost 10 years in Social Insurance Institute as a chief of the research department. And we in Albania, reforming the social insurance system since 1993, has opened the opportunities for Albanian immigrants to continue their social insurance in our country, because most of them are working in the informal economy in Greece, in Italy, and in other countries. So my question is, do you have this kind of voluntary, we call voluntary social insurance, for all those who are not working in formal employment economy, so which are not formally employed, that, for example, the immigrants also in other countries to have the opportunity to continue their social insurance, that at the elderly to have at least one pension.
So Nilu, did you have something?
And the quick answer to that is no, we don't have something like that in the UK, sadly. But it would be very useful, because one of the things that we find is that the older population provide such a boost to the formal economy. So sometimes, just to give one example of one woman that I worked with, she was offering childcare to children from 4 of her children, to her grandchildren, which enabled 8 adults to work full time. And that's a huge contribution that one person makes that isn't visible when we look at the economic activity of migrants. So, Marion?
Yeah, thank you. Well, what I can say is that what we see is there are, so typically when I work on return migration, so I can see this issue of transferring access to like social insurance and like social security, basically, and healthcare. within the EU, it's possible. But if it's outside the countries with which you have the agreements, it's not possible. And what I can see with retirement migrants is that you do have your home countries which can do typically make it possible for you to keep a health insurance, you know, in your home country while living abroad, but it's more expensive. And so the thing is that typically in retirement migrations context, those who need this kind of insurance are those who live abroad on a longer term. And often those are rather those who do not have so much money, because those who have enough money will rather commute between countries. So what I'm saying is that there are options, but it's not, all groups do not have, you know, the same kind of access to those insurances. But I think your question shows the importance and the complexity of thinking of social policies internationally. And to me, this is a very interesting topic, but very complex also. And yeah, anyway, thank you for your question.
Thank you.
That's great. Well, we've got a comment from Satya that she thinks that the BAME, I guess, designation, the term, is quite outdated, and we should move away from it and get used to either ethnic minority or minority ethnic groups, pointing towards recent research and government reports. So a very good and interesting point there in terms of the terminologies that are used. You know, sometimes in a policy context, overgeneralization of the experiences of migrants. And I think one of the takeaways from the discussion today is the great diversity of experiences of older migrants. It's not one particular group. It's many. There are some common themes in terms of experiences, but an intersectional approach can pay quite a lot of dividends in terms of both from an academic point of view, understanding the lived experiences of older migrants, but also in a policy context, so that older migrants have the tools that they need in order to prosper in terms of their life planning, their retirements, their planning for caring, and so forth. Thank you all for such great discussion today. I just have a couple of quick announcements about this. First of all, most important is be sure to go to your library, to hop over to your library as soon as possible and ask them to buy the book. It's called Aging in Migration in a Global Context, and it's published with Springer. There's an ebook available as well, and of course, we have a lot of students now who are relying on the internet to get their books. There's a great point that Lorna just made, that this book is not only going to be interesting for academics, it would be a great resource for modules for students in a range of disciplines. So either go out and buy the book or ask your library to do so. A reminder as well that we have through Frontiers in Psychology a research topic on aging and migration status, intersectional forms of discrimination and exclusion. We already have one article which has popped up on there. I've been a little bit slow in getting my article up. We're looking for a range of contributions, not just presentation of research, but also commentary pieces, policy context pieces. If anybody's really keen to write a book review, I know a great book to review for that. I'll put a link onto the Age Diversity webpage on that, and we'll be putting this video for anybody who hasn't been able to see it today. We'll be putting a link of the webinar onto the Age Diversity website. I guess that's all that's left for me to do is to thank Marion and Nilu for this great presentation. I'm really excited to have a look at the book, and thank you all for coming today.
Thank you very much for giving us the possibility to present the book. It's very nice.
Thank you. And if anybody wants to present in this forum on your own work, then please just drop me an email and we'll fit you in. And yes, so there's a question about, would you be happy with us sharing your slides as well? I can put that onto the Age Diversity website.
Yes, of course.
That's brilliant. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.